he's going to speak for a while, and then a couple more people, including me, will have a few words related to the lakes. Also, social activism to what you might hear from him.
You guys want to come in this way? That's where I'm locked up.
Well, right away I can see this is a problem, which it usually is in my case. However, I always appreciate the opportunity to stand while everyone else sits so that I can see people eye to eye. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you so much for coming out on this evening. You could obviously be right in a lot of other places on this beautiful early fall evening with a little moisture in the air, which I don't know about you, but in my part of the world, in Northeast Ohio, I lived in the Cleveland area now, grew up in Akron. That is something that we certainly deem very precious. So appreciate you choosing to prioritize being here. I hope you don't regret it, but it's just okay. Well, how many people here have heard of Move to Amend? All right, a few people. We've already propaganda. Move to Amend is a social action organization that is trying to amend the United States Constitution. Pretty ambitious, I should say, and you probably agree as well, but we think is absolutely essential. And given the state of affairs in terms of our political, economic, constitutional, environmental, social, and moral positions of where we are in each of those arenas, we are reaching limits. We're reaching points of, I think, no return. We're reaching saturation points. We're reaching critical areas or critical spots where, in the case of our political constitutional systems, people are questioning the very legitimacy or credibility of them. That can't go on indefinitely without major changes happening, without profound changes happening. We are facing, in any one of those arenas, profound crises, profound fundamental crises. But I think we're seeing some of these tracks occurring and racing at about the same time. So if they reach this cliff abyss, whatever it is, the sense of no longer there being a sense of legitimacy or credibility, then there's a synergy effect. And I am thoroughly convinced, as are many others, that profound crisis requires profound solutions. And that's what Move to Amend seeks to do. I just want to, I guess, sort of really begin by acknowledging all of you. How many people here are from this congregation? Okay, a few of you. Well, you then know about, and some of the rest of you, even if not you, viewers may know about the Unitarian Universalist Fine magazine called UU World. It comes out every month, and way back in May, June of 2003, May, June 2003, the issue of UU World was entitled, Does He Have More Rights Than You Do? Appropriately, it should have been it, because the it in question was corporations. Because the subtitle of this is How Corporate Personhood Threatens Democracy. How corporate personhood threatens democracy. Now, again, May, June 2003, 7 years before the Citizens United decision. Everyone here aware of Citizens United? That's the Supreme Court decision of January 2010 that many people believe is when this problem of super duper wealthy individuals buying, renting, leasing, or retaining, I can never quite figure out, public officials and perverting and corrupting elections began That's when many people believe that started. Many people also believe that's when this whole idea, this other equally bizarre constitutional construct of corporations having inalienable constitutional rights began. I don't know if those of you maybe in the back can't quite see this timeline that Move to Amend, a number of other groups actually, well before Move to Amend, put together, including the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and a few others. But this is a timeline of personhood, rights and powers, gains and losses. Corporations are above the line, people below it, and you will see the Citizens United decision is way down here. Meaning, this was the latest manifestation of the take your pick, preemption, usurping the people ever had authentic, self-governing, self-determination, democratic abilities, right to decide, take your pick. That's all the way down here. So what, my friends, is all the rest of this stuff? All the rest of this stuff, particularly above the line and below it, is pieces of our nation's history, our elements, our movement. All the rest of this are examples of, again, the hijacking, the preemption, the usurpation of what was, in many cases, in fact, in most cases, never intended, but was intentionally and deliberately created. So I just want to babble at you a couple of minutes before we get into the current horrific examples, and we could spend talking about all of the current manifestations, could we not? And everyone here, I know, could spend time giving first-hand experiences. And you don't need, do you, to be a PhD in political science or a constitutional attorney to realize that our government is not broken, but rather it's fixed, as in rigged. And it's been that way for a very long time. And it's been that way not by accident, but by design. And will stay that way forever and ever and ever, until and unless we do something about it. And that's sort of the theme of this talk. Corporate rule versus democratic revolution. It's up to us. So the premise behind that is that, A, we have corporate rule. 2, we need a revolution. Some think democratic. Some may think, it should be something else. We think it should be democratic. Some may feel revolution is too strong. Okay, if that is too strong for you, even though we call it nonviolent, but it's still that R word is too strong, then it's okay to take the R off so that what's left is democratic, nonviolent evolution. Fine, I'll take that. And the other piece of it is, my friends, it's not up to them somewhere else. Those we elect, those we anoint, those we bow down and pray to or whatever, it is up to us to take charge for the conditions of our lives. Because we've left it, have we not, to the so-called experts, political experts, the constitutional experts, the economic experts, the media experts, and so many others, and they've blown it. We have to make democracy a verb and not a noun. So, this piece that I passed out, there are a couple gents in the back. Gosh, you may have to share. You go. So just a minute, if I might, you wouldn't mind just humoring me for a minute, to go over this sheet, okay? It is extremely important that we understand the kind of fix that we are in. that again precedes the Citizens United decision. Again, the decision that extended but did not initiate this turning over of our elections to super duper wealthy individuals and to corporate entities. It's extremely important that we understand that that was just the latest slice of the salami or of the loaf of bread. Pick your favorite food metaphor. Enchilada. Now maybe it was the largest piece, and I think arguably one could make the case, because it's like anything. When people are in the habit of sort of getting what they want and being in power for a long time, even if they've been skilled and apt at trying to cover it up and making us think something is one thing instead of another, doing bait and switch and having the barrage, the myth, the lore that we live in an authentic democracy, after a while, you get greedy. And I think that's basically what happened in the Citizens United decision. They went too far. And as a result, people who more or less live their lives under this increasing corporate rule and corporate takeover of our society that's been going on for more than a century saw the blatancy of it, this latest manifestation. And it really all began sort of in the 1880s. Some say even earlier. The 1819 Dartmouth College versus Woodward. They gave corporations for the first time standing. I don't know how many people here are constitutional experts, but if you aren't, let me assure you, that word is nowhere mentioned, anywhere in the Constitution. It doesn't appear. So its appearance has come from not elected officials, whether back in the day, what would it have been? Federalists, Democratic, Republicans, when did the Whigs get going? Whigs, Socialists, Communists, then later Democrats, Republicans, Greens, Libertarians. No public official in the history of this country has ever voted to give corporations constitutional rights. Inalienable constitutional rights. By inalienable, we mean basically rights that should be bestowed upon human beings because they're human beings, because we're human beings. Now those rights can be different from one society to another, right? Right. Some societies it's more political, others it's more economic, some it's some of each. With religious, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has 7 categories of human rights. No constitution on the planet is quite that broad. And now we have certain countries that not only have inalienable rights declared to people, but also to the natural world. Truly natural rights. Ecuador, a couple of others, have given nature standing in front of courts. Well, we're not quite there. We don't even have decent, inalienable rights for human beings. But anyway, I digress. So, these rights were intended early on solely and exclusively, the Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments, to protect we the people from the all-powerful state, government, the organized collection of power. That's what it was. No vote by a public official, nor has there ever been a social movement, right? A social movement, people coming together and educating, advocating, organizing to say, oh my gosh, we need to change the culture. We need to change the laws. We need to change the Constitution. We people have got way too many rights. Corporations need more rights. So let's organize a social movement. No, it never happened. That's beyond bizarre. That never happened. The only way corporations attained these never intended constitutional rights that were meant for people was because of the courts. And since corporations were mentioned in the Constitution, that favorite phrase that we hear about from our friends on the political right, activist courts, here we have exhibits all the way down this sheet. A through B through C through, and actually there's dozens, scores, hundreds of instances. These just capture the most sort of the first, in many cases, of these horrific instances. So 1886, Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific, first time, sort of, I mean, it's a backstory to it, where 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment meant to give freed black slaves due process and equal protection. Corporate attorneys go before the Supreme Court, made up of corporate attorneys, surprise, mostly railroad, corporate attorneys, and say, with a straight face, that the 14th Amendment, the designers of it, the architects, had actually all along intended the 14th Amendment not just to apply to free black slaves, but also to corporations. And the court, with a straight face, said they agreed. And that's what continued. And it was, I mean, there was sort of kind of a murky thing. We could spend a lot of time, but it's kind of, don't want to dive into the muddy stuff. But in 1889, for sure, the Minnesota and St. Louis Railroad Company versus Beckwith is when they won both due process and equal. There's a lot of elements to the 14th Amendment. Those are among the two most important, and that's voila, when they won it. Kind of like if you're into chess and you're a pawn and you're able to get the pawn all the way to the end of the board, what happens? You become a queen, which that queen can move in every direction, and not one space at a time, but all across the bloody board. And that, my friends, is power. And that's akin to what corporations get when they get constitutional rights. Lochner versus New York, 1905. They won 14th Amendment and Commerce Clause rights. Commerce Clause, that part of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, that was intended to, allow free trade of goods and services between states. That was used and continues to be used and continues to be corrupted by corporations to say communities, states, don't have the right to protect, say, the importation of toxic trash, of radiation, of whatever the case may be. That's what's happened today. The Commerce Clause has been used as an anti-democratic battering ram to prevent, as this says, hundreds, between the 14th Amendment and the Commerce Clause, hundreds of democratically enacted laws at the state level that protected and still protect workers, consumers, the environment, communities. Hale versus Henkel, 1906, Fourth Amendment rights, search and seizure rights. Fifth Amendment, 1922, Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mayon, the takings clause. Here in this case, people in Pennsylvania, in this community, living in their homes, all of a sudden their homes implode. They collapse. Why? Because the coal company was mining coal underneath their homes. A vacuum. Homes collapse. Those citizens actually had the audacity to go to court and say, we should be compensated for our homes collapsing due to coal being mined underneath our homes. Community said, sounds reasonable? Sounds more than reasonable. The corporations went to court and said, to do that is violating the Fifth Amendment takings rights, which is meant, maybe you've heard the term, you take somebody's property without due process and without just compensation. Know the term for that? Eminent domain. So eminent domain was meant to apply just to individuals. They said, no, it should apply to us, and not just for what has happened, for what maybe has been taken already, but for future profits, which in the case of the coal company would have amounted to millions of dollars that in 1922 would have been equivalent to maybe tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of today. What local community can afford that? So the corporate rights, takings rights, ended up preempting the community rights, the person's rights, the homeowner's rights to be compensated. International Dairy Foods Association versus Amsoy. First Amendment, corporate right not to speak. Here, we're talking about, corporations, when they spend money in elections, that's what they claim their right to speak. Here, they're saying it's their right not to speak. And in this case, again, how dare those citizens in Vermont saying that, what were they thinking? That they should have the right to know what the products are in their food? That for health, safety, and welfare, they should know the ingredients and whether bovine growth hormones are in their milk products, in their dairy products, in their yogurt. Of course, what happened? Dairy industry goes to court and said, that's violating my right not to speak, not to self-incriminate. Court said, we agree. So again, the corporate First Amendment rights preempted the community rights of health, safety, and welfare. And we've seen this being used many, many times. So, I spent that time going over this. For basically one reason. It goes back before Citizens United, but only as far back as 1976, which I can't even read. That's not a real good definition of anything approaching anything remotely akin to representative democracy, self-determination, self-governance, right to decide, but more like oligarchy, monocracy, plutocracy. All we need to do is have greater transparency. All we have to do is either get the courts to do it or have a constitutional amendment. And there are some groups that are out there. Let's just have a constitutional amendment that only, which on the generational opportunity is to deal with this problem in total. Because to simply reverse Citizens United takes us back to those grand, glorious, democratic nirvana days that we had the day before Citizens United passed. Remember those great days? Those times when our voices were heard, our communities were helped, our needs were met, where our public officials returned our phone calls, if not tweeted us. No, I don't know if they even have Twitter back in 2020. I lose track of my true face. But regardless, we didn't have anything remotely approaching a representative democracy. Not even close. We believe the problem goes far beyond that. And that is why Move to Amend has developed what's called the We the People Amendment. You open up the brochure in the red panel. It talks about what it is that we're trying to focus on. That has two elements. One, the radical notion that only natural persons have constitutional rights. By natural, we mean as opposed to artificial. Artificial persons are what corporate entities are. And by corporate entities, we're talking about for-profit corporations, non-profit corporations, and unions. This would apply to all of that. So no longer would inalienable constitutional rights be bestowed on any artificial person, only natural person. Now maybe one could make the case that even this is way too modest, and that maybe we should be following the example of the Ecuadors out there and include giving nature standing, given the kind of mess that our natural world is in. So that is a definite argument to be made. The other part is that money is not free stuff. Money is like what? Like land, like if we own homes, like the crown jewels that I'm sure you have hidden away in your basement, either the precious metals or expensive paintings you have on your walls. You know, money is property. Money's not speech. If we equate $1 with one vote, that's how corporations run. That's not democracy you're supposed to be. We have, my friends, a very imperfect democracy that goes back, as I alluded to at the beginning, to day one, in which, from the start, who was considered a person? Any idea?
White male.
White,
Men,
male,
with property.
property owners. Women?
No.
They were, you know, what, like the rib of a god. I mean, they had no inalienable rights to speak out, right? People of color, they were, what fraction was it? 3/5 of a person. just for purposes of making sure that the South had enough electoral delegates to win presidency. 3/5 of a person. Article 1, Section 4, the Return Servants Clause, shows they aren't people, they're property. Because if they escape from the South and go to the North above Mason-Dixon line, sorry, you're still not free. Because if you're quartered in somebody's home, you are in essence stealing that slave owner's piece of property. Which is why coming to the North wasn't enough, you had to go to Canada. In my state of Ohio, 700 stops on the Underground Railroad. Many of them by Quakers, many of them by Unitarians, Presbyterians, other people of faith, people of high ethical conviction, who were committing civil disobedience, should we say, to focus on this unjust giving. Native people, they weren't even any fraction. They weren't the ribs, they weren't 3/5, 2/5, 1/5. They were considered beasts, not even a person. People who were renters, white guys in particular, finally did get the right to vote. They were the first. But all these other groups had to organize movements to drive themselves into the Constitution, where actually, my friends, they should have been there all along. They should have been there all along. A very imperfect Constitution. But one thing they got right, it may sound like a digression, but bear with me for 60 seconds. What they got right pertaining to this arena is that they understood that the revolution at the time that those four fathers were a part of, mothers though, did their bit, no question. Didn't get much credit for it. The revolution wasn't just simply a revolution against the king, George, but against the king's two other arms, military arm, redcoats, and political/economic arm, called crown colonies or crown corporations, like the Massachusetts Bay Company, Carolina Company, Baltimore Company, Maryland Company. That when the revolution occurred, no longer was the king the sovereign. Who was the sovereign? We the people, on paper, right? No longer was there redcoats. We had a continental army and had our own navy. And no longer were there these crown corporations. These crown colonies, crown corporations were given a license to do business. So a group of people wanted to come colony, across the pond, come over here, do business. They just didn't do what they wanted to do. They could only do what the king, the sovereign, permitted them to do through this thing called a charter, a corporate charter that was an instrument of definition and control. And those individuals that had a charter to do the business in the Massachusetts Bay Company, Virginia Company, and all the others could only do what the king stipulated exactly and precisely in that charter and nothing more. And if they did go beyond, when we had this revolution, that idea, okay, that sounds like a pretty good idea. The colonists guys thought. And so we'll continue the idea of we need corporations to build chairs and roads and mills and all sorts of things. Useful goods and services. But we'll make sure that we stipulate the terms to people who wanted to do these things in a charter that was now in this new form of society that, on paper anyway, was called a democratic republic, imperfect though, was still one in which we, the people, through this charter, it was considered to be a democratic instrument. And people could only do what was in that charter. If they tried anything other than that, their charter was revoked, and it happened routinely. So the whole idea of corporations gaining all of these rights was one of three ways that they sought to escape democratic control, that democratic muscle flexing through the charter. Just like anybody here, a professional person that requires a charter to do business in the state of Indiana, doctor, lawyer, architect, a lot of people, a lot of professions require a charter. It's a way to establish certain principles, right? Certain affirmations, certain guidelines. That's what a corporate charter is. A democratic instrument. So, this idea of corporations being granted constitutional rights was one way they escaped that defining, that authorizing, that we are in charge, you are the subordinate mindset. It's extremely important we understand that because we are told today, tremendous story, we get emails all the time, phone calls, what you're doing, it's going against what is inevitable, irreversible, it's how it was meant to be, and it's kind of like what, gravity? It's sort of like the tides coming in and out, it's kind of like the swallows returning to Capistrano. Nonsense. It was intentional and it was deliberate by these guys, for the most part, that issued activist Supreme Court justices that concocted out of thin air this notion of corporations being persons. And money along the way, much more recent, 1976, being defined as free speech. In both of those instances, originally, that idea, that concept, didn't exist, and those realities of control of money in elections, and that control of corporations and the relationship between people and corporations was defined in the legislative arena. What these constitutional decisions by activist Supreme Court did was shift it from the legislative arena to the judicial. Hope I didn't lose it. It's very important to understand that by having the courts come in and say no longer can state legislatures or the federal government decide how much money is going to be maximally determined to be contributed in elections. No more can you, the state level, define corporations and give these sort of charters that are, democratically enacted tools. That both of those are examples of the shifting of where that arena of decision-making was in the legislative arena, where those we elect have a role in deciding, and we sometimes can have a direct role if we have citizen issues. But that was moved from the legislative arena to the judicial. This, my friends, is a reversal. It's saying, no more are we going to have this protective moat around corporations and money in elections. No longer are we going to have the Star Wars sort of protective shield. Let's move it back into the legislative arena and go out and talk about how and to what degree corporations should have protections, and they should, and to what extent money should be privately contributed. Maybe we should have mandatory public financing of elections. There are some instances of public financing of elections, maybe you've heard of them, in Maine, in Arizona, in I think the judicial races in North Carolina, a few other places, but they're voluntary. They can't be mandatory because money is defined as free speech. Well, that could be on the table for discussion. We could discuss that in our Congress, in our state legislatures, in our city councils. What we're trying to do with this, and why, again, diverge in talking about it, is because this is a very conservative approach. It's calling for, at what time, what once was. Let's shift back the discussion and deliberation of what role corporations should have back into our legislative arena, and the same with money speech. So what Move to Men is trying to do, and here is, and we can get into it when we discuss these issues momentarily, is a couple things. History has shown we need to learn from our brothers and sisters who have come before us, who sacrificed immensely, and those who are parallel, working in other countries, building social movements. There are some lessons to be learned. And one of them is, you cannot let the powers to be co-opt you. You have to build your own independent movement. That's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to focus not, look at this, if you look at any of the proper information over on the table, you will see that our main focus is not Congress, it's not the president, it's not the Supreme Court, it's not corporations, it's not regulatory agencies. It's us. It's focusing on what we need to do. We need, my friends, and I can't speak for other people, but I know that my mind was compromised for a long time into believing that, oh, we can't go that far. That when we talk about this, we can just nibble around the edges. We can't talk about fundamental change because fundamental change is impossible. Fundamental change is just way pie in the sky. We have too many immediate needs, things that require immediate fires to be put out. I use a cane because it helps me walk. I'm with scoliosis and several operations, so it helps in that department. But every once in a while, it's also a pretty nice problem. And so, many of you, and I'm included, are involved in single issues. Single issues are like a cane. If I had a silo to help me walk around, I'd use that. Same idea. The idea being that we all, to a certain extent, really drill down and work on important issues, don't we? Healthcare, trying to stop that toxic dump in our community, dealing with education, the corporatization of education, boycotting fruits and vegetables. I mean, there's a lot of fruits and vegetables that we could boycott one at a time. There's a lot of things that require us responding, reacting, and resisting to, especially since the last election, especially. But if all we do is respond, resist, and react, if all we do is oppose and don't ever propose, we will always, my friends, be on the defensive. Always. We will always be responding to somebody else's agenda. Always. We will always burn out and be ineffective in the long term. Always. Because we're dividing ourselves. Rather than simply, and don't give up working on those issues, but rather than spending all of our time focusing on the single issue, vertical approach, we need to work horizontally. And by horizontally, I mean to work on that kind of approach, not an issue, but a strategy that will make all of our issues easier to realize. Now, one can argue gerrymandering may do the trick. But even if we deal with gerrymandering, that's not going to deal with all these other. We can elect Jesus, Gandhi, by the way, birthday today, October 2nd. Just saying. Gandhi, Jesus, Mother Teresa, whomever. We can elect all of those people tomorrow. The reality is, my friends, the political system that we are in, which never was that wide to begin with, over time, with corporations gaining more rights, money being defined as speech, all these people we elect operate within a smaller area, or three-dimension. That's it. It's important that we work on changing or keeping good elected officials. That's akin to focusing on the players of the game. And it's important that we work on our issues, those issues that they are, and some of them involve protections, regulations that protect the environment, food safety, everything. It's important we do that, but that's akin to focusing on the plays of the game. But if all we do is focus on the players of the game and or the plays of the game, but ignore the rules of the game, we are sunk and will be sunk forever. What Move to Amend is trying to do is deal with the rules of the game. We're trying to create a social movement, and how our brothers and sisters in the past have done that is by focusing on changing the culture. Getting ourselves first and then those around us to break out of this mold. That what's going on today is inevitable and irreversible. You can't do it. You can't think about it. That's nonsense. What has been historically impossible in one era becomes inevitable in the next. Who would have thought, not thought all that long ago, that gay marriage would be constitutional? Who would have thought it? Even not that long ago. But of course, that movement didn't begin Just not that long ago, it began a long time ago. Those who fought to end slavery were working on that well before the Civil War through the people going by horseback, including Unitarians, a lot of people of faith, the William Lloyd Garrisons of the world out there. Those who worked for the rights of women to vote, beginning in the first 1848 Seneca Falls Convention in New York, right after. I'm from Akron, Ohio. One of the key second-tier conventions was in Akron, Ohio with escapes. Who's the African-American woman? Ain't I a woman? Sojourner Truth. Because of social media and the like. Because we have to have it. So I just simply end with this. There is a Chinese saying that goes, you are likely to end up where you are headed. Where are we headed? What direction are we headed? Think about it. Where's that arrow pointing to in these arenas? Is our economy sustainable? Do we have a greater or narrower disconnect between what people want on issue after issue and versus the kind of policy we have or don't have? Is there greater credibility among the institutions in our society today? What about our social relations? Do we treat one another with basic inherent dignity and respect? How about our environment? How's that working for us these days? Are we taking care of it? Are we looking at it as a part of us, or continuing to look at it as something just there to plunder and morally or ethically? None of this can hold. We are likely to end up where we are headed unless we change the rules of the game. I try not to be melodramatic about it, but it's pretty hard to look at things today realistically, think very positively, unless some major changes happen. And they can, if we decide we want to be part of the solution and step up. So Move to Men has created efforts all over the country, passing hundreds of resolutions at the municipal level by city councils, county commissions, gotten municipal ballot measures passed, where people go around, get signatures, get it on the ballot. Whoever gets on the ballot, he wins. One exception, because the wording was bizarrely constructed. People didn't know what they were voting for. They voted no. It's passed in a dozen communities, states, I should say, states, including Montana, Washington State, New York, California. Hundreds of organizations go online that pass resolutions. So those are ways we're trying to reach out. We're trying to go broad. We're trying to go deep. Hopefully, you could be a part of us. Consider, please, doing what you can. I'll pass out a volunteer sheet here momentarily. If you're part of this congregation, consider endorsing. If you're part of another group, organization, consider them to endorse. We have to change the culture. Changing culture changes laws. Changed laws changes culture. We have to work together.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to take up about 5 minutes of time.
Yeah, you make that.
Good evening, everyone. I am Teri Cento. I am a member of the Indiana Green Party. I am currently the chair of the Circle C Greens, the Greater Indianapolis Regional Caucus, which covers Marion County and surrounding areas. I serve as the communications director for the Indiana Green Party, and I am currently the communications director for our candidate for Secretary of State, Dr. George Wolf. I am a paralegal. I work as a marketing coordinator and an IT administrator. I am a U.S. Army veteran and a mother of a special needs child. A world-renowned expert on mythology, Joseph Campbell, once implied, if you want to identify what's most influential in a society, don't examine its arts and literature, rather look at its tallest buildings. When you approach a medieval town, the cathedral was the tallest of the buildings. When you approach an 18th century town, the tallest was the political palace. And when you look at the horizon of today's cities, you see the tallest buildings as corporation-owned and banks. It is found that money, not people, influence public policy. Researchers at Princeton University looked at 20 years of data to try to answer a pretty simple question. Does government represent the people? This is what they found. This axis here represents the support of any given idea. On the left at 0 are the ideas that not one single American supports. On the right at 100% are ideas that everybody supports. The vertical axis represents the likelihood that members of Congress would pass a law that reflects any given idea. This graph, this line right here, represents an ideal republic. If 50% of the people support an idea, it doesn't work that way. Take an idea that nobody supports. There is a 30% chance that it'll become law. Now, it's an incredibly popular idea. The most popular idea that this country has ever known. And it has a likelihood of 30% chance of becoming law. But there's a catch. This flat line represents the majority of Americans. It represents me and you. It represents the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, and people who could afford lobbyists have their own line. Look how close it is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. How does this happen? Well, follow the money. Right now, it is perfectly legal in America to buy political influence. Our representatives spend approximately 2/3 of their time in office fundraising for their re-election campaigns. They bankroll their campaigns from the economic elites, big business interests, and lobbyists who literally write the bills that Congress passes into law. Democracy works best when everybody's voices are heard and represented. Unfortunately, big money in politics is the norm, and its narrative teaches us to choose the lesser evil. The Green Party opposes corporate personhood, corporate speech, and corporate control over America's public spaces, media, and elections. Through a series of decisions, the U.S. Supreme Court has dramatically expanded the ability of wealthy individuals, corporations, and groups to spend as much as they like to influence our elections. Greens reject these rulings and seek to overturn them. Greens support amending the U.S. Constitution to define that money is not speech. Human beings, not corporations, are persons entitled to constitutional rights, and full regulation or limitation of campaign contribution and spending. Greens support public financing of campaigns and elections through a system where small donations are matched with public funds. Greens want to eliminate dark money in elections, including amending Section 501c4 of the Internal Revenue Code. The legal bribery of our elected representatives must end, and we must assert that corporations do not possess the same intangible rights as we the people. The Green Party is a key partner in the Move to Amend coalition and firmly believes that corporations should be stripped of their personhood. The Green Party depends on people for its support. We believe in democracy. One person, one vote, not $1, one vote. Our planet cannot afford business as usual any longer. We must not settle for the lesser evil anymore. Green Party candidates do not accept money from corporations, and they are running for office all around the country and even in the state of Indiana. The corporate ruling class will not save us. They live in luxury at our expense. We, the people, must wrestle the power away from them. Future generations are counting on us. So let's move to amend and go green.
See if this, I don't think this is really helping any. Can anybody here figure out anything?
I don't think it really worked.
Sorry about the scan too, folks. Here we are. I'm Bruce Russell Jane, and I'm a member of All Souls Unitarian Church and a retired Unitarian Universalist minister. And I was asked to tie what you just heard to our social justice activism here at All Souls. And I've learned a lot tonight, so I'm not sure how closely I'm going to be to what you said, but here goes. The Unitarian Universalist Association adopted a set of guiding principles in 1984, which congregations and individual UUs try to live by. The fifth principle says, we covenant to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. So we see democracy in almost religious terms and as intrinsic to our church and our government. The roots of this in our history go back at least 150 years. I quote from an email from Reverend Anastasia Zinke, also a senior minister, to the congregation on September 23rd, about a week ago. Abraham Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, visited Boston and returned to Springfield with some pamphlets authored by the Unitarian minister and theologian Theodore Parker. Herndon wrote that Lincoln marked with pencil the portion of a sermon Parker delivered on July 4th, 1858, entitled The Effect of Slavery on the American People. Lincoln underlined Parker's phrase, democracy is direct self-government over all the people, by all the people, for all the people. Lincoln incorporated this phraseology into his Gettysburg Address. She goes on to say, we have seen that our democracy currently does not hold all people equally accountable under the law. We have seen that inequality is maintained by selective power in the absence of broad power that lies within us. We have seen America becoming more and more for corporations and elites over the interests of the common people. End quote. So I learned a little bit about how this came about from Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains, the deep history of the radical right's stealth plan for America. In that book, she details how the libertarian economics movement, backed by the Koch brothers and led by political economist James McGill Buchanan, through extensive operations over 6 decades, have altered every branch of government to reduce democracy of the people, by the people, and for the people, in favor of liberty for the wealthy to do whatever they want. They do not want us rabble to be able to impose our will through the government. for health or safety or environmental reasons, because we may restrict their ability to act with impunity to make more money. For the last few centuries, while standards of living have risen, unpaid costs of doing business have been accruing. The manufacture of almost everything we eat, live in, or play with has been powered by fossil fuels and has released carbon dioxide, so much so that the Earth's atmosphere is warming and will inevitably do so for many decades to come. To make things worse, carbon extraction companies are tearing up the land and poisoning people's water faster than ever before. And they are doing it in an ever more risky and dangerous ways and places. Fracking in Pennsylvania, tar sand strip mining in Alberta, oil fields in Kenya, and coal plants in India. They are creating sacrifice zones where the land and its people are forsaken. And it doesn't seem to matter to Halliburton and the Koch brothers how distressed we are about global warming. They just continue to exploit oil, gas, and coal miners. Yes, the unpaid hidden costs of undemocratic business practices is being paid mostly by the poor and working people of the world. Because I am convinced global warming is the largest and most important issue of our time. Wait for this one. I worked the last 4 years with Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light, an organization which helps Indiana congregations conserve energy and install solar panels as a faith response to climate change. One of our climate justice advocacy efforts, along with the Sierra Club Citizens Action of its coal ash sites. Some of Indiana's coal and oil-based utilities and the Indiana Regulatory Commission aren't responding well to the people's needs. Last year, the state legislature passed an industry-backed law which makes it less cost-effective for individuals to install solar panels. In fact, our government and public utilities continue to fight renewable energy, consumer choice, and air, water, and toxics cleanups, which disproportionately hurt poor people. And they don't seem to be doing anything to help Indiana coal miners whose jobs are going away as coal becomes economically less viable. In his encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si, Pope Francis says its expected toll on human society is staggering. Global climate change is reducing access to drinking water and food and negatively impacting human health, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Although climate change affects all human populations across the globe, it hits those living in poverty the hardest because they depend on the surrounding physical environment to supply their needs and have limited ability to cope with climate variability and extremes. Francis urged us to create a new sense of spirit and caring for the entire world. And to do that, it is essential that we work with the poor. Connecting with the people most affected by global warming is not only the moral thing to do, it keeps us environmentalists focused on the human experience of our evolving world, and it strengthens feelings of friendship, mutual support, and community. So if we are to advocate for climate justice, we need to be advocates for wider democracy, one that is truly of the people, by the people, and for all the people. Thank you very much.
Hear, hear. All right, so comments, questions, queries, consternations. Yep.
Yeah, actually, I heard it move to an end when they first formed because we've got a local chapter of the Alliance for Democracy here that's kind of struggling along with a few members left. And
Oh, there still is? There is an alliance.
It is, there is an alliance here, isn't that right, Claire?
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but I was embarrassed when I found out my older brother Fred in Brecksville, Ohio, participated participated in an MTA effort to get a local.
What's his name?
Fred Peterson.
I know Fred.
That's great. I'm glad you did. I gotta get your whole name, I'll tell him I met you. But
Great guy, great guy.
he is, he's now on the school board in
He is.
Drexel, which is wonderful because he's fighting privatization real hand and fist. But can you tell us about the local resolution process? I don't know if we have any local, we don't have state initiative and referendum, unfortunately.
You don't have.
No, we don't. I don't know if we have anything local along those lines. It could just be, but we do have a more progressive local municipal government than we've had in the past. Can you tell us about municipal, local, and/or statewide resolution processes, not necessarily having to do with initiative and referendum?
Well, first, first, just the story about Clarksville. What the hell is heck of a story? This community, not to be partisan about it, because we like to think this issue is not only nonpartisan, but transpartisan. Goes beyond. And I think Brecksville, Ohio is a perfect illustration, not to be partisan about it, but in the same election that Mitt Romney defeated Barack Obama 2-1 in Brecksville, that wording on the red panel, Luterman, passed at 52%. Same election, same election. And that's because people get it. People understand. People across the political spectrum know. And just feel it in their bones that the system just is not working for them. And Fred and a small cadre of people, not very many, a dozen people tops, went out, hustled, got enough signatures to get a measure on the ballot. You know, citizen initiative is a way to do an end run around public officials, the middlemen and middlewomen, and they were able to get this on the ballot. And with basically no money, no, even before it went on the ballot, even before. Of course, the city fathers, I think they were all
Yeah, they fought it.
fought it to the Board of Elections. Board of Elections split, goes to the Secretary of State's office, Republican, put it on the ballot. Let the people decide. Goes to the Supreme Court, all Republicans, there's one independent. Put it on the ballot. Let the people decide. And then the city spent money, I think they sent 1 or 2 mailers to everybody. Meanwhile, this group, again, 2-1 Republican registered, threw a few bucks together, came up with just simple, I think, copy machine stuff, went door to door, built relations, talked to people, built relationships one-on-one and one. Great story. Great story. Now, what was it? Oh, yeah. Initiatives and resolutions are really great ways to make this issue real. And even though your state may not have that option, not everyone does, your municipality just might have a way to get something directly on the ballot.
Or if not, the city county council is accessible.
Yeah, but the first thing to do would be to look at your municipal charter and see if there's a provision in it for either resolution, or, I mean, what does it say about resolution? But in particular, what does it say about an initiative? If you can't directly come up with language and get something on the ballot directly, then what you want to do, obviously, is approach your city council, municipal council, whether it's city or county, and approach the person you think would be the most important. Bring this language, and I can supply to anyone here some template language that's been passed by some quote-unquote politically conservative communities, and say that, and see if they feel they would know the best what the political internal dynamics are of your municipality, whether it's Indianapolis or any suburb. And sometimes it's easier, actually, to get a suburb, smaller community, where you can work it, easier access to public officials. You get a couple of them to pass it, then you go to your urban area. It's the whole thing of selling encyclopedias. You get somebody on the block, well, your neighbor down the street purchased a set of encyclopedias. You're going great, you got to keep up with the Joneses. So think of it in that way, and maybe approach go for the lowest hanging fruit, so to speak, whether that's the largest community population, the smallest, whatever the case may be, and then work your way up or down to the most difficult, depending on how you look at it. But I'd be glad to send you either anything else. Before I get another question, let me just pass out. These are some forms. Sure, thank you much. So everybody gets an envelope, everybody gets, all right. So this is here, the shameless self-promotion, where if you're interested in helping in any way to get something related to Move to Men going here, fill it out, and also a place at the bottom to commit to making a contribution in any sort of form by either your time, hours a week, or monetary. Or on the back, if you want to pledge. It's even better. Yes, here and here.
Well, I have several, but I'm only gonna ask one. What would happen to all the law, this existing law that's passed? Do you have any businesses that are for this?
Two great questions. People may know, right, what you learn in 12th grade, because we all learned this in 12th grade, right? That there's a distinction between constitutional rights and statutory rights. Statutory rights are statute laws, basically. Laws that are passed by legislatures as opposed to laws that are created by the courts. So, a lot of what protections or rules, if you will, that corporations are governed by are by statute. Those we don't have anything to say about. In fact, protection, statutory rights might be needed to be extended. If any of you here, some of you already get our emails, some of you, maybe you've seen over the last month or so, we've sent out 2 emails asking if people are interested in becoming involved in what we're calling a model corporate code working group. We are of the belief that this We the People amendment is inevitable. It's either going to pass or we're going down. I mean, as a whole society, democracy, whatever. I mean, one or the other. But constitutional right, that's a statutory right. The protection of corporations being treated as a unitary actor or contracts and the like, that's a statutory right, not a constitutional. We think maybe there should be quite a number of additional statutory rights. So we are now trying to gather together people that will start looking at this now. Statutory rights are given at the state level and at the federal level.
For corporations.
For corporations. So that's that. The other point was
Any
businesses.
on board?
There is the American Independent Business Alliance, AMIBA, AMIBA.org. American Independent Business Alliance. Businesses for Sustainable Alliance, Businesses for Sustainable Alliance, or Businesses for Sustainable Development. Coalitions of small businesses support this. They're not, think about in your community, small businesses. How much extra cash do they have to throw at politicians to buy, rent, lease, or retain them? Not a whole lot. Most small businesses around my part are just trying to stay afloat. They're up against the Amazons of the world and the big box stores, right? So they're not the ones that are corrupting whoever, legalized bribery. They're not the ones that are participating in the system of legalized bribery. It's the large ones that are the ones that by giving or investing in the political system, that are getting the low interest loans, the perks, the tax breaks, the avoiding prison time. Wells Fargo. How many instances, how many millions of accounts did they just create, stiffing people? All of these instances, years ago, Wells Fargo Corporation would have been gone, would have been dissolved. But because they are a major campaign contributor and lobbyist, they're able to stick around. If it was a very small bank that were involved in one small percentage of that, they'd be out of business. So small businesses, they feel that they are in an unfair competition economically. And there's a term for that, it's called crony capitalism. When you have, as a large entity, the ability to manipulate the political system to benefit you against your competition. And that's why the big box stores, for example, have had such, their way. And when there have been efforts, Lewis and Lewis Company versus Lee, 1933, Florida, state of Florida, tried to pass a law, tried to give small businesses a lower tax rate than large businesses. And with the court, you're violating my 14th Amendment equal protection right. You are discriminating against me. So again, 14th Amendment designed to protect originally free black slaves got perverted to protect large businesses against small business. Local community people wanting to give preferential treatment to small businesses. I mean, you hear about small businesses, the basics of this country, and yet they couldn't do it because it's discriminatory. So a lot of small businesses get it, they're for it. When we've had our public hearings related to this, we get quite a number of small business people to testify on this. I think you were.
Yeah, it was similar to this question. If all these rights that they have go away overnight, what does corporate America look like after that? Looks smaller, probably, and state. And I just wondered if you had
Sure.
any thoughts on what that looks like.
Well, what it means is they no longer have the ability, as we say, to govern. All of these things, if you look at it, for the most part, one way, shape, or form, they are involved in governing decisions. To be involved in that arena, where originally through the chartering process, they were not allowed to be within. They were not allowed to be in the political, economic arena. Sure. Now, what role they should have versus small businesses, versus for-profit corporations, versus cooperatives, that's a form of business. We tend to think business equals for-profit corporation. There's a lot of other types of business models out there that maybe, again, in Ohio, yes, you get a lot of those perks and subsidies that go to for-profit businesses. There's a whole network of cooperatives. They try to approach the state to get some low-interest loans, to get some subsidies, forget it. They've not got it. So, without capital up front, it's not hard to do business. So, what we think would happen is, all right, they're no longer involved in the political arena. It would mean that they now would be in the economic arena, no longer being subject to the crony capitalism. Best ideas emerge, right? I mean, isn't that what, on paper, capitalism is supposed to really be about? So let's see. Yep.
First, I want to say you are a really good public speaker, so thank you for being here tonight.
I fooled another one.
You could teach public speaking if you weren't doing all this. I learned a lot tonight. I didn't know much about your movement. I definitely believe that corporations shouldn't be people and money is not speech. But the devil is in the details, so I'm trying to envision now, say the state of Indiana, if this were in our Indiana Constitution or say the U.S. Constitution and we were signing along. Can you point to a community or another country out there, or what would your ideal campaign limitations be? Or, if I'm running for mayor and the fruit stand down the street wants to give me $100 to make flyers, would that be allowed? And how do you implement?
Yeah. Well, let me pass this around first. If you've got the envelope, whatever, throw it in. If you want to throw a few bucks in, do that. Thank you very much. Pledge, you can do that. You'll notice how short this is. Devoid of specifics.
Yeah.
And that's because we are not trying to be the Moseses coming down from the mountain saying, oh, we know exactly what the role of corporations should be in our society. Or we know the exact amount that there should be allowed to be spent for Congress, for the state legislature in Indiana, any of that. No, no. As I mentioned before, what this is about is a conservative idea of moving back, of shifting back these discussions in the relationship between people and corporations and between people and money back to the legislative arena where we can go at it and have now a full and robust democratic discussion, hopefully without fisticuffs.
Yeah, because when you say, no person should have less access because of their economic status, that's a whopping principle.
How it gets
It's an
implemented,
ideal principle,
right,
but it's.
but how that gets implemented
Yeah,
should be, we think, a democratic decision made in the legislature.
gotcha.
That is the three branches of government, that is on paper considered to be the most small d,
Yeah,
not being partisan, small d democratic. Okay? Not the executive, certainly not the judicial. But, so let's put it back in the legislative branch. Now they can discuss with our inputs, because again, at the legislative arena in many states, you can do an end run around them, and if you don't like what they're doing, heck, we're gonna put in an issue. If they pass something that you don't like, heck, we're gonna put a referendum. Because those are the three, the progressive era, reforms, initiative, referendum, and the one they hate the most, recall. Right? The populists and the progressives, put those in, back in the, sort of that era. So, we're not prescriptive, we're saying let the people decide.
so just to follow up, and I want to talk about your time. The communities or in Montana or in Ohio, are there any implementations being done where people just pass this as an ideal
Yeah, I mean, this,
saying, I support this?
yeah, when communities do this, this is not, when communities pass this is nothing more than basically a statement.
Of principle.
A principle. Now, a number of communities have created an element that does create actual law at the local level. And that law is, we sort of hook in something called Democracy Day public hearings. And what that means is that in addition to just passing this and saying, oh, the people of Elkhart, Indiana, are calling on Congress to pass a constitutional amendment. But we're also mandating the municipality, either every year or every other year, to sponsor a locally city-sponsored hearing on people can show up and speak to the impact of corporate rule and money elections on their lives, their community, their neighborhood, wherever they want to go with it. Some people might talk about environmental issues, some people might talk about, education, some people might talk about, from a moral perspective, the threat, just to democracy in general, wherever it goes. People get 5 minutes to say their piece. So that's built in, that's part of an ordinance. But the rest of it is symbolic because it's not a trigger.
But it's a start.
It's a start. Our Constitution limits, there are some constitutions on this planet where if you do get a certain number of people on a petition, boom, it automatically goes on the federal ballot. We don't have that. Switzerland does, do others. Yeah.
Do you anticipate that there will be more meetings like this throughout the state, or are we it?
At the moment, congratulations.
It's hard to get a hold of something, if you don't see the bigger picture, where we're going.
I'm less than one state over in a sense. And I'm coming back in end of November, early December. I'm going to do northern Illinois and Iowa. And so, there's some discussion of maybe I'll take a stop in Fort Wayne.
There's no real initiative here in this state.
2 words, not,
Yeah.
the ball is in your court. We're here to help. we'll do everything we can, best practices, we have a whole board sit, in watching it as a way to widen the circle. So, hey, you know, I came to this program, I threw some tomatoes at the main speaker, but we're ready to do a follow-up, and, so, you know, here's a video that we want to show. That oftentimes is used as a natural follow-up. I've been just on this tour. I've been on the road 10 days or so, and I stopped in Champaign-Urbana at the Union Church there. And, oh, you know what?
We just love champagne.
Oh, okay. And Jefferson City in Missouri, the Union Church there. And both of them is sort of a next step.
And depending on you, but you
Yeah, right. But I think as the next step, they were going to look at, as a congregation, to pass a resolution, but also then maybe to show that documentary called, not legalized bribery, but legalized democracy. Wouldn't that be refreshing? Okay, somebody else? Yeah.
So I stepped out for a moment, and I hope I'm not repeating another question. But could you tell me where you are on the benchmarks from 2016?
Yeah, there aren't many,
Sure.
no, there aren't many groups out there doing what we're doing that has developed a plan that is more than 2 or 3 months. You know, that's one of the things I think we, whatever we want to call ourselves, leftists, progressives, anti this or that, but, you know, we tend to be pretty reactive. And there's a time and place for reaction, but proaction, I think largely you're better the more you have sort of a plan of action. And the more you can develop a long-term plan, even if you have to make adjustments, the better. So we decided, all right, we're going to jump in 2 feet and develop a 10-year plan with benchmarks about, you know, getting this introduced in Congress, getting groups started, getting groups to endorse, you know, getting volunteers that are on board, getting affiliates started, which maybe that's where we start here, and so on. And so we're in year 3, and we've already exceeded the number of endorsements at the congressional level in the House of Representatives. So the number there is, what does it say?
45.
We're up to 65 in the House. Now, we had a goal in the Senate. We've had a tough time getting it introduced in the Senate, but we just now are getting it introduced in the Senate with 7 or 8, I mean, we'll see how many of them will be elected, those who are up, who will, by the end of this year, be co-sponsors. So I don't know, what is the Senate? Well, 10. So we'll be not quite there by the end of the year. And we have, you know, quite a number of, I'm not sure what else. It's listed there. Yeah. 18. So 2018,
So the volunteers.
volunteers, we're maybe about half that, about 900, so 1,800. We do have a political action committee to support and oppose state or federal candidate. We're starting one anyway. We've had convergences around the state. State legislatures have passed resolutions. Well, we actually have had, this had 10 state legislatures. I think there have been 12 or 13 states. Not legislate, a combination of legislatures passed, but also some that have gotten on the ballot. Okay, and that's more meaningful, of course. When you get something on the ballot, people, you know, directly vote for it. Yep.
Are you familiar with the conference that was held at Community last year on the regular system?
Yes.
And are you going to be at the one in Nashville
Oh, there's one coming up.
in March?
Yeah, our national director, Kate Belknap, is there.
Well, we're going to be at that one. We went to last year too. It's awesome. It would be perfect for.
Well, we tried to get a place there, but they didn't think we had any importance.
I'm quite sure we will.
When is that, in May?
In March,
March.
it'll be in Nashville, Tennessee.
Thanks for that. Yes.
I've been sitting here trying to get a perspective on how this happened with the courts. And maybe I missed something. But our judges, and I know nothing is initiated at the Supreme Court level, it's the highest level appellate court. But all these cases above the line came up through the courts. Our judges are supposed to be the most respected, impartial people. Supposed to be. And you would think early on, in the early years, they definitely were.
That's right.
And there's been a trend in the later years to have more elected judges. But in the early years, the preponderance was they were appointed. And I just don't understand how the courts became so friendly toward business and corporations.
Yeah. Well, it didn't happen overnight, of course. And I think why early on, you're quite right.
I mean, I could see it with
Yeah.
our elected representatives and,
Yeah.
you know, buying votes and all that.
Right.
But, you know, judges are, they're our most respected
Could I mention
citizens. They're
a
supposed to
resource?
be.
Okay, I'll answer that, but yes, if you have something to speak to that.
I think it's Mark Hertzgaard, but, is he the one who wrote Unequal Protection?
Tom Hart,
Tom Hartman, that's right, I'm sorry, I get those.
good piece.
But anyway, Tom Hartman wrote a book called Unequal Protection, and he really addresses the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad case in that strongly. You had a court reporter who had been a railroad attorney, and
That's the Santa Clara case I mentioned. There were
Yeah.
a lot of details there that I didn't want to.
And his head notes were used by future courts. The Supreme Court is not just recently, the Supreme Court going back a long time, and American politics going back a long time, has been run by money, basically. More or to a greater or lesser degree, depending on, you know, who's able to, you know, mount any kind of a challenge
Yeah.
to money. But, you know, these court cases, just like today with the Supreme Court justice candidates and or appointees we're seeing today, a lot of times the Supreme Court justices came out of the legal system that served the corporation,
Yeah.
basically, and just treated their bench on the Supreme Court as if they were there to serve the corporation.
Yeah.
That's what's happening.
Yeah, you're quite right. What is your name?
My name's Karen.
Karen, you asked me a very important question, very important question. You know, how did this happen? How did this come to be?
I always think,
And-
consider the
and-
source, and I just.
Yeah,
really-
well, again, early on, just think for a moment, early on, people who, at the very start of this country, had lived directly under the thumb of the crown colonies and crown corporations, right? And a king. So they knew firsthand, not just intellectualizing it, but maybe they had a wound from the war, or maybe they were beaten up by some goon connected to the Massachusetts Bay Company, or were drafted because these companies just didn't have economic power, they had governing power, they had the ability to tax, they had the ability to draft. So, you know, when you experience something firsthand like that, you're gonna act accordingly. But as the time goes on, you hear from your parents, and you hear from your grandparents. It's not quite the same. And meanwhile, corporations aren't stupid, corporate attorneys aren't dumb. They see how they were being controlled and defined through charters. They were being issued one at a time for specific purposes, for specific reasons. If you got a charter to build a chair, you couldn't build a stand. And if you did, you were violating the terms of the charter. So the company said, all this democratic muscle flexing at the legislative level, we gotta figure out how to subvert it. And so that's when they came up with these three ways to do it. One of which was to say, we wanna shift decision-making from the legislative arena to the judicial. That's corporate personhood. But there are two others. One, they wanted to shift decision-making from the legislative level to the state level, where corporations were chartered. Almost every corporation in this country early on was chartered with state
Still
law.
are.
Yeah, with the exception of like banks. First and Second National Bank was chartered at the federal level. You know, you had to take horse and wagon to get to DC. Really difficult. So, wow, all of a sudden, that person was far more removed. And then the third way to escape control was to shift decision-making from the legislative arena, and this is hard for people to get, to the regulatory arena. The regulatory agencies that we tend to think of as, oh, they're protecting us, right? Environmental Protection Agency, Food and Drug Administration, all of these agencies, yeah, to some extent, early on, did that, but they've been captured. And in fact, they were designed that way. The first one, the Interstate Commerce Commission, created to regulate the railroads, was created with the blessing of the railroad companies, because far better to be regulated than to be publicly controlled. And at that time, you think about it, back 100 years ago or so, there was this whole movement by the populists and the progressives to have public ownership of utilities, of electrical systems, water systems. We still have some water systems. Now, of course, everything's being privatized, but far better to have that stuff being monopolized, you still have your monopoly, but be regulated, and you can make sure the regulators, you get them appointed, you can always go to court, that kind of stuff. So anyway, long story short, to answer your question, over time, corporations figured out these ways to do an end run. And when it came to the court, think about how at the Supreme Court, how those guys, so recently they were all guys, how did they get there? Constitution says two entities have the power, the president and the Senate, right? President, how's the president come to be president? By popular vote? By electoral vote.
Yeah.
And how is then that person confirmed? By the Senate, which early on, how were senators chosen? Constitution, not direct election. It was the 17th Amendment that pushed for by the populists and the progressives that had direct election. It used to be appointed by the state legislatures, and there was all kind of corruption associated with that. So these justices ended up, there was no direct democracy, even sort of, tertiary wise. So who do they represent? The corporate elites. Is it any wonder that these decisions, and of course the corporate crowd, they just keep at it, pounding. So what? If they lose this time, they lose this time. A lot of how court decisions happen is you lose, maybe, but you get some dissent. Somebody, you're right in there, you're working in a law office. So you understand how it sort of works, that, you get a statement, even if you lose, somebody in dissent says something that you then use as a brick. And you just keep building these bricks, precedent, until what had been lost for 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, now becomes a brick. So they just keep at it. And you know what? They're still at it. A couple of years ago, even after Citizens United, came McCutcheon versus FEC in a couple of years in 2014, that said the cumulative effect of contributors. There's limits still on how much money a person can contribute to a candidate, but there used to be limits on the cumulative effect. Like I could give no more than, I can't remember, $37,000 collectively to people running for the House. Until after McCutcheon, then you could just give the maximum individual amount to every single candidate if you want running for the House. Of course you was that. And then of course, a couple of years later, no, the same year, Hobby Lobby. Remember that one? Yeah. That beauty? That one didn't quite, but virtually said, not the owners, not the human being owners of Hobby Lobby, but Hobby Lobby Corporation had the freedom of conscience to deny healthcare coverage, contraceptive coverage, to women, because of the religious rights of corporations. So you get rid. You wake up tomorrow morning, and this is gone. What's it say? This is gone. Citizens United is evaporating. Guess what happens? It's like a balloon. You squeeze the balloon here. Okay, when you control it here, what happens to the rest of the balloon? It gets bigger everywhere else. So what do you think they're going to do? They're going to take that First Amendment right not to speak. Exxon, for example, somebody mentioned something related to the environment. Exxon Corporation, all the information that they've been sitting on, knowing the connections between the burning of fossil fuels which releases CO2 and climate change. They've known that linkage for decades. People are trying to get at that out to hold them accountable. How's that for radical ideas? To hold them accountable. They've gone to court in Texas. Their defense, that you would deny my First Amendment right not to speak, and they won. Now it's being appealed. So again, people's right to know that the potential is affecting the climate, they are being pushed back. I heard somebody once say, the problem in this country when it comes to climate, the problem in this country is that we have a Statue of Liberty on the East Coast, but we don't have a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. That's pretty good. Because liberty or freedom without responsibility or accountability is chaos. It's pathological. And that's why originally in this whole movement, there was a film that came out many years ago called The Corporation. Our video back there is 26 minutes. Perfect to be seen and used for education. The Corporation, 2.5 hours. Brutal to watch because it's so long. But it's accurate. And it talks about the corporation being a pathological entity because there's no accountability. So, other questions? Comments? All right. Well, I hope that I'll have an opportunity to work with some of you after tonight, by some of you being interested and committed to working on doing what you can in consort with people everywhere else in this country to move, as you so aptly said, to move to amend the general law with our partners like the Greens, with the unions, with so many other groups. Because so many other groups realize that to get anywhere fundamentally on their issue, don't drop it, but spend some of your time working on it. All right, thanks so much. And again, pick up a bunch of swag up there, a bunch of stuff, including